I woke up on an ordinary morning, but as soon as I looked out the window, everything was turned upside down. Construction trucks and massive machinery were parked all over my driveway, blocking every entrance. My carefully tended garden had been turned into a construction equipment lot, and the irrigation system I'd worked on for years was completely destroyed. Before I could even process what was happening, Gabrielle Walsh, the HOA president, stood in the middle of the trucks, holding a piece of paper with her signature sweet smile, telling me everything was for the community's benefit. I stormed outside, unable to contain my anger. "What are you doing on my land?" I shouted, furious. Gabrielle looked at me, still smiling, replying in that familiar sweet tone, but behind it, there was a coldness I knew all too well. "Wade, don't worry, everything's for the betterment of the neighborhood. This improvement will benefit us all." I couldn't stay quiet. "You have no right to take my land. Move these trucks now," I yelled. But only then did I realize something crucial. Gabrielle wasn't just improving the neighborhood. She had been lying to me, using her HOA power to secretly seize my land, turning it into a construction site for projects I had no knowledge of. And I knew this wasn't just some small project. It was part of a larger scheme she was carrying out. Gabrielle Walsh was the kind of person you couldn't easily overlook. As the president of the HOA in Sagebrush Estates, she held considerable power, but it was her ability to manipulate others that truly made her dangerous. Gabrielle was ambitious, always appearing friendly and sweet to everyone, but behind that charming exterior was a cold, calculating, and determined mind. She inherited her family's construction company, and instead of using her position as HOA president for the community's benefit, Gabrielle exploited her power to push through development projects that ultimately benefited her and her family. The projects she promoted, which were touted as improvements to the neighborhood, were in fact strategic moves to seize land and create profit for herself. Everything was wrapped in the guise of community development, making it difficult for anyone to see the danger lurking beneath the surface. Gabrielle wasn't shy about using her power to manipulate community decisions, ensuring that everything from zoning changes to land use was in her favor. And when it came to getting what she wanted, she would stop at nothing. The first time I confronted her, I thought it was just a misunderstanding. But the more I observed her actions, the more I realized Gabrielle wasn't just pushing for improvements. She was quietly orchestrating a plan to seize my land and the neighboring properties, to develop them into lucrative real estate projects for her and her family. What seemed like small, harmless changes were actually just the first steps in her larger scheme. One day I could no longer stay silent after discovering construction trucks and machinery parked on my land. I stormed outside, unable to contain the anger building inside me. "What are you doing on my land?" I shouted, losing my temper. "You have no right to interfere with my property." Gabrielle stood there, still smiling, sweetly as always, but I could sense the sharpness in her tone. "Oh, Wade, don't worry. Everything is for the development of the neighborhood. Sometimes change is necessary for us to move forward. I'm just doing what's best for all of us." Her response only made me angrier. "You have no right to take my land. Move these trucks now." And that's when it hit me. Gabrielle wasn't just carrying out a simple renovation. She had been using her power to secretly seize my land, turning it into a construction site for projects I had no knowledge of. I realized that this wasn't just an accident or a mistake. It was a deliberate strategy that Gabrielle had planned all along. After discovering Gabrielle's trucks and machinery parked on my property, I knew I could no longer stay silent. Each day, it seemed like more vehicles and construction equipment were being added to the growing invasion of my land. My driveway was blocked, and the once peaceful, secluded environment that I had carefully maintained for years was becoming a construction site. It wasn't just the physical damage, it was the emotional toll of feeling like a stranger in my own home. My property, my sanctuary, was being stolen from me piece by piece. It wasn't only the financial loss from the damage that was eating away at me, it was the invasion of my privacy and the violation of my rights. The trucks weren't just parked haphazardly, they were clearly taking up permanent residence, as though my land was theirs to do with as they pleased. I tried to ignore it for as long as I could, hoping the situation would resolve itself. But it kept escalating, and the day I found an invoice from the construction company that Gabrielle had hired for the trucks parked on my property was the final straw. The invoice wasn't just for the vehicles occupying my land, it detailed an entire operation that Gabrielle had been running. She wasn't just parking trucks there. She had been running an unauthorized business from my property, charging construction companies a fee to park their equipment on my land without my knowledge or permission. She was profiting off my land without even asking for my consent. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The very property I had worked so hard to maintain was being exploited by Gabrielle for her personal gain. My frustration grew by the minute, No one had bothered to notify me, no one had asked for my approval. It was as though my property didn't matter. Determined to confront her, I marched outside, unable to contain the anger that had been building for weeks. When I found Gabrielle standing near the truck's clipboard in hand, looking as confident as ever, I snapped. "What are you doing with my land?" I demanded, my voice tight with rage. "You have no right to do this. You can't just take my property without my permission." Gabrielle, as always, smiled, that fake sweetness in her eyes. Her demeanor remained calm, even as my blood boiled. "Oh, Wade, don't worry so much," she said, her voice dripping with that smooth, reassuring tone I had come to dread. "I'm just helping the neighborhood grow. Everyone will appreciate what I'm doing in the end. This is a good thing for all of us." Her words were like a slap in the face. She didn't even seem fazed by the fact that she had crossed a line. To her, this was just business, a small, insignificant issue. But I knew better. This wasn't just about improving the neighborhood, this was about a calculated scheme to take control of my land to use her position for personal gain. It became painfully clear that Gabrielle wasn't just moving forward with construction projects. She was executing a well-thought-out plan to seize my land and the land around it for herself and her family. I realized that this was no longer just a misunderstanding. Gabrielle wasn't acting in good faith. She was using her power to take what wasn't hers, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. As the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I had tried confronting Gabrielle, but her sweet words and promises only masked the deeper, more sinister intentions behind her actions. It became clear that she wasn't just running a simple construction project. There was something far more deliberate and strategic happening. The trucks and machinery continued to pour in, occupying my land without permission. The damage to my property was mounting. The irrigation system I had carefully built was now broken beyond repair. The landscape I had spent years tending to was destroyed, and yet Gabrielle remained unbothered. Every day, the pile of evidence grew, but it wasn't until I started digging deeper into the situation that the true extent of her manipulation came to light. One afternoon, I was going through some old paperwork when I stumbled upon a set of documents I had overlooked earlier. Among the piles of receipts and contracts, I found something that made my blood run cold, an official-looking zoning document and a set of plans for the neighborhood. What struck me wasn't the fact that the documents existed, but rather what they revealed. Gabrielle had been altering the neighborhood's zoning plans without informing the residents. She had quietly changed land use designs, moving boundaries to incorporate my property into a larger construction zone, all without so much as a notice to the community or a single vote by the homeowners. My land, which I had thought was protected by the original agreements, was now part of her covert expansion project. I felt the blood drain from my face as I realized the full scope of what was happening. Gabrielle wasn't just stealing my property piece by piece. She was orchestrating a systematic land grab, and my land was at the center of it. She had managed to manipulate the HOA into approving changes that would benefit her family's construction business. I started piecing things together. The trucks on my land, the broken irrigation system, the constant construction noise. It wasn't just an accident. It was all part of Gabrielle's grand plan. Desperate for answers, I spent hours researching every scrap of information I could find about the neighborhood's plans. Eventually, I discovered that not only had she altered the zoning documents, but she had also manipulated the HOA board into rubber stamping her changes. No one had questioned her authority or the legitimacy of her decisions. I wasn't the only one being affected by Gabrielle's actions. Several of my neighbors had voiced concerns about their properties being impacted, but no one had any concrete evidence. I, however, had the documents that proved she had been lying to all of us. It wasn't just that she had taken my land for her projects, she had done it without any legal authority, without any vote, and without any transparency. My anger grew with every piece of information I uncovered. Gabrielle had used her position to line her pockets at the expense of the entire neighborhood. She wasn't just pushing for development. She was intentionally taking what wasn't hers and making it seem like she was doing everyone a favor. The more I learned, the more I realized that this wasn't just about a few trucks or construction plans. It was a full-scale effort to seize control of the land and resources of Sagebrush Estates. At that moment, I knew that I couldn't just sit back and let this happen. I had to act before Gabrielle's plan became a reality. I spent the next few days gathering all the documents I could find to build a case against her. I reached out to my neighbors who were willing to listen, and together we began to form a strategy to fight back. Gabrielle had underestimated me, but she wouldn't get away with this. That evening I confronted Gabrielle again, holding all the evidence I had gathered. She wasn't as confident as before, though she still smiled that same fake smile. I could see the tension in her posture as she noticed the papers in my hand. "I know what you've been doing," I said, my voice steady but firm, a sense of calm coming over me as the truth came to light. "You've altered the zoning plans. You've been manipulating the HOA, and now you're taking my land without my permission. This is illegal, Gabrielle." For a brief moment there was hesitation in her eyes. Then with a strained smile, she replied, "Wade, I don't know where you're getting these ideas, but you're misunderstanding everything. I'm just trying to help the neighborhood. You'll see everyone will thank me for this in the end." I wasn't fooled by her words anymore. This isn't about helping anyone. You've been lying to everyone. You're stealing from us all, and you'll have to answer for it. Gabrielle's smile faltered, and I knew she was beginning to realize that her carefully crafted illusion was starting to crumble. But I wasn't going to stop. I had the truth on my side, and now I had the evidence to prove it. The more I uncovered about Gabrielle's actions, the clearer it became that the damage to my property wasn't accidental. It was part of a larger plan, a deliberate effort to ruin my land so she could take control of it. The trucks and heavy machinery were just the beginning. The destruction to my property was growing more evident every day. The irrigation system that I had spent years building from scratch was completely destroyed. What had once been a lush green garden full of life was now nothing more than a wasteland of broken pipes, crushed plants, and discarded construction debris. I felt like I was watching my entire life's work be systematically erased. My frustration and anger grew every day, but it wasn't just about the physical damage to my property anymore. I started to feel like my rights, my sense of security, were being stripped away. Gabrielle wasn't just taking my land, she was taking away my sense of control over my own life. She had turned my sanctuary into a battleground, and I had no idea how much worse it was going to get. One afternoon, as I was inspecting the damage, I noticed something else, something that made my stomach turn. A section of my property, which I had always carefully maintained, was now completely flattened. The soil had been disturbed, and large heavy equipment had left tracks that crisscrossed across the land. I could tell that Gabrielle's construction crews had been working on my property without my permission, moving earth and reshaping parts of my land to make room for something. I immediately went to my neighbors hoping they had noticed the same thing. But to my surprise, no one seemed to be as concerned as I was. Some had heard about the construction, but they assumed it was part of the improvements Gabrielle had promised. They didn't understand that it wasn't just about new buildings, it was about taking away what belonged to us. No one had the full picture except me. Frustrated and feeling increasingly isolated, I decided to take action. I reached out to the local government hoping they would help me. But to my dismay, I quickly learned that Gabrielle had already gotten to them. The local officials seemed reluctant to get involved, brushing off my concerns with vague promises of looking into it. When I tried to escalate the issue, I was met with resistance, as though everyone in the town was either too afraid or too complicit to stand up to her. Gabrielle's influence seemed to reach everywhere. Even the officials who were supposed to be there to protect the public were clearly under her thumb. I couldn't accept the idea that I might be powerless to stop her. The more I tried to go through the proper channels, the more I realized Gabrielle had covered all her bases. She had manipulated the system, and now I was stuck left to deal with the fallout of her greed and deceit. It wasn't just my property that was at stake anymore, it was the entire neighborhood. I knew I had to take matters into my own hands. I started documenting everything. Every truck, every broken pipe, every piece of equipment that crossed onto my property. I recorded video evidence, took photos, and wrote down everything that happened. I knew I needed to have irrefutable proof if I was going to have any chance of stopping Gabrielle. But even with all the evidence in the world, I knew I would be facing an uphill battle. Gabrielle wasn't just some small-time operator. She had power and influence. She had made it clear that she could bend the rules, and now it seemed she was getting away with it. Despite the mounting evidence, I still couldn't get any help from the authorities. That's when I decided to reach out to a lawyer. I found a local attorney who had experience with property disputes, and he agreed to help me. The lawyer was as shocked as I was by the extent of Gabrielle's actions. But even with legal representation, we still faced an uphill battle. Gabrielle was using every trick in the book to avoid accountability. She had the money, the connections, and the power to keep the system on her side. But this wasn't just about legal battles or financial compensation anymore. It was about standing up to a bully who thought she could do whatever she wanted, regardless of the law. I wasn't just fighting for my property, I was fighting for every resident of Sagebrush Estates who had been too afraid to speak up, too intimidated by Gabrielle's power to fight back. And the more I uncovered, the more I realized that I wasn't just dealing with a single land grab, I was up against a woman who had been using her position to exploit the entire neighborhood. One evening, as I was walking through the damage on my property again, I found something that made my blood boil. I discovered a piece of paper tucked under a pile of debris, another contract. This one was a formal agreement between Gabrielle's construction company and a group of subcontractors. The contract outlined a plan to demolish parts of my property in preparation for a massive new development project. Not only had she been violating my rights by using my land without consent, but she had also been planning a full-scale development that would have destroyed everything I had built. It was clear now that Gabrielle's plans weren't just about taking a little land here and there. She was in the process of demolishing my home, the place I had poured my heart and soul into. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I was being forced out, and Gabrielle had already set the wheels in motion. She wasn't just taking my property, she was taking my future. Determined not to let her win, I called my lawyer immediately. We had to act fast. I knew the battle ahead would be long and difficult, but I couldn't let Gabrielle destroy everything I had worked for. She thought she could get away with it, but I wasn't going to let her. After discovering the full scope of Gabrielle's manipulations, I realized I had to act fast. I couldn't let her get away with what she was doing any longer. But the legal process was more complicated than I had expected. Gabrielle's influence was far-reaching, and the more I tried to find allies in my fight, the more I realized how deeply entrenched her power was in the local government. I had thought the authorities would be on my side, that they would help me stand up to her, but the reality was far different. I found a lawyer, someone with experience in property disputes and fighting against corrupt practices. At first it seemed like we might have a chance. My lawyer was astounded by the evidence I had gathered, the zoning changes, the unauthorized construction, and the manipulation of the HOA. It all painted a clear picture of what Gabrielle was doing, and it was illegal. With the evidence in hand, we thought we could take action. But then I began to realize just how far Gabrielle's influence stretched. When I approached the local authorities with my evidence, I was met with resistance. I had expected them to be alarmed, to help me push back against Gabrielle's overreach. Instead, I was greeted with vague promises that they would look into it, and things take time. It felt like I was hitting a wall at every turn. I tried to push harder to escalate the issue, but it was clear that Gabrielle had already made sure the local government would not interfere. I began to suspect that Gabrielle's influence had seeped into every level of the local administration. Officials who should have been impartial were now giving me half-hearted responses, brushing off my concerns as if they didn't matter. Every time I tried to escalate, the answers grew more evasive. The mayor, the planning commission, everyone seemed to be either too afraid to act, or worse, complicit in Gabrielle's schemes. It wasn't just the officials who were being unhelpful. When I spoke to neighbors who had also been affected, many of them expressed doubts or reluctance to get involved. Some were simply too afraid to speak out against Gabrielle. She had cultivated a reputation as a leader who knew what was best for the community, and many believed that challenging her was dangerous. They didn't want to get caught in the middle of something that could cost them. I could feel the weight of their indifference pressing down on me, making me feel more isolated than ever. But I couldn't give up. I started looking into other avenues to expose Gabrielle's actions. That's when I stumbled upon something even more disturbing. I discovered that Gabrielle had used her position as HOA president to block any attempts by residents to challenge her decisions. She had systematically silenced anyone who dared to question her, even using the HOA's resources to manipulate the community's opinion of her. It wasn't just about land and money, it was about control. She had built a fortress around herself, and it was clear that I wasn't the only one who had been made to feel powerless. I knew I had to act on my own if I was going to have any chance of stopping her. I continued to gather more evidence, documenting everything that was happening on my land. I kept a detailed log of the trucks, the machinery, the damage to my property. I photographed the ongoing work, the contracts I had found, and the unauthorized changes to the zoning laws. I even managed to get copies of the HOA meeting minutes, which revealed how Gabrielle had manipulated the board into rubber-stamping her decisions without any transparency. Armed with this new evidence, I decided to take a more direct approach. I reached out to a local news station. I knew it was a risk, but I was desperate. I couldn't let Gabrielle continue her plans unchecked. I sent the news outlet a detailed report of what I had discovered, hoping that shining a light on her actions would force the authorities to take action. The news station was quick to pick up the story. Within days, a reporter was on my doorstep, eager to learn more about the corruption that had taken root in our community. As the story aired on local television, I felt a sense of both relief and fear. Gabrielle's carefully constructed image of the benevolent leader was starting to crack. The community was beginning to see the truth, but I knew that Gabrielle wouldn't go down without a fight. In the days that followed, Gabrielle tried to spin the narrative, but it was clear that the public perception was shifting. The residents who had once stayed silent were beginning to speak out. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years were reaching out to me, offering support and sharing their own experiences with Gabrielle's manipulation. It felt like a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. But Gabrielle wasn't backing down. She used every resource at her disposal to try to discredit me, to make me seem like the troublemaker. She contacted the media, trying to frame the situation as one of miscommunication. She even went so far as to hold a community meeting where she publicly attacked me, claiming that I was a hindrance to progress and that I was standing in the way of the neighborhood's growth. Despite her best efforts, the tide was starting to turn. The more I exposed her actions, the more people began to see through her lies. Even the local authorities who had once turned a blind eye to Gabrielle's influence were now being forced to take a closer look at her dealings. The public outcry had become too loud to ignore. But I knew this was just the beginning. Gabrielle had deep pockets, and I wasn't going to let her use her power to silence me any longer. The real battle was just beginning, and I was ready for it. After weeks of fighting through the bureaucracy, legal channels, and public backlash, I realized that there was no turning back. Gabrielle had managed to turn the tables, casting me as the villain in her carefully spun narrative. She had used every tool at her disposal to discredit me, from manipulating the HOA board to creating a campaign of misinformation that had turned many in the community against me. But despite all her efforts, one thing was clear: I wasn't the only one who was fed up with her manipulation. As the media coverage of Gabrielle's actions continued, more residents began to reach out to me, each with their own story of how Gabrielle had used her position to bully, manipulate, and even steal from them. Some had been quietly displaced by her construction projects. Others had seen their property values plummet as a result of her shady dealings. It became clear that I wasn't just fighting for my own property anymore. I was fighting for everyone who had been affected by Gabrielle's unchecked power. The community meeting that Gabrielle had called to defend herself was a turning point. She had tried to paint me as a troublemaker, someone who was holding the neighborhood back. But when I stepped up to speak, I wasn't alone. A handful of residents, once too scared to speak out, had come forward to tell their stories. One by one, they shared their experiences, revealing how Gabrielle's actions had harmed them. It wasn't just about land grabs anymore. It was about the kind of person she really was. As the room grew tense, Gabrielle tried to maintain her composure, but I could see the cracks starting to show. Her facade of the caring, community-driven leader was crumbling under the weight of the truth. She tried to deflect, claiming that we were all misunderstanding the situation, that I was the one stirring up trouble. But no one was buying it anymore. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't hold back. I laid out all the evidence I had gathered: the altered zoning documents, the unapproved construction, the fraudulent business dealings, and I presented it in front of everyone. I showed them the contracts, the photos, the video footage of her trucks on my land. I called out her lies, her manipulation, and her greed. And as I did, I could feel the tide turning. The residents who had once been silent were now speaking up, standing behind me. Even those who had been too afraid to act were now beginning to see the truth. Gabrielle's attempt to regain control of the situation backfired. She was no longer the all-powerful HOA president with everyone on her side. She was a woman exposed, her true nature revealed to the community she had once controlled. The residents who had once been too fearful to stand against her were now demanding answers. They were beginning to realize that I wasn't the enemy Gabrielle was. But even in that moment, I knew that this was only the beginning of a much larger fight. Gabrielle wouldn't give up her power easily. I had exposed her, but I was sure she would retaliate. And sure enough, she did. The following days were filled with threats and attempts to discredit me further. Gabrielle reached out to my lawyer, trying to pressure him into dropping the case, threatening legal action against me if I didn't back down. She used her influence to try and turn the media against me, spinning the story to make me look like a paranoid troublemaker. But this time I was prepared. I had the truth on my side, and I wasn't going to let her scare me into submission. The pressure was mounting, but I refused to back down. Gabrielle had made a mistake. She had underestimated me, thinking that I would crumble under the weight of her power, but I wasn't going to be silenced anymore. I had everything I needed to prove her wrong, and I wasn't about to let her manipulate me any longer. It was clear that the battle for control over the community, over my land, was going to be a long one, but I had come too far to turn back. I wasn't fighting just for myself anymore. I was fighting for the future of Sagebrush Estates, for everyone who had been taken advantage of by Gabrielle and her schemes. The point of no return had come. I knew that this war wasn't over, but I also knew I wasn't going to lose. I prepared myself for the next phase of the fight, knowing it would be difficult, knowing Gabrielle would fight tooth and nail to maintain her grip on power. But I was ready. The truth had been revealed, and there was no going back. I had crossed the line, and I wasn't going to stop until Gabrielle faced the consequences of her actions. The HOA meeting was finally here, and I could feel the tension in the air as I walked into the room. Gabrielle had called the meeting, no doubt hoping to regain control of the narrative, but this time the community wasn't going to be on her side. I had spent the past weeks gathering evidence, documents, photos, videos, all the proof needed to expose her for what she truly was. I wasn't going to let her spin the story in her favor this time. As I stood up to speak, I could see the skepticism in the eyes of some residents who had been swayed by Gabrielle's charm. But there was also a sense of anticipation, an undercurrent of excitement among those who had long been silenced. The tide was turning, and they were ready for the truth. I've come here today not just for myself, but for all of us. I began my voice firm but steady. For far too long, Gabrielle Walsh has used her power as HOA president to manipulate, deceive, and take from all of us. She has lied to this community, altered zoning plans without our consent, and even used our own land for her profit. And today, I'm going to show you the evidence. With that, I began displaying the documents I had gathered, zoning maps, contracts, invoices, each piece building the case against her. I showed the residents the photos of trucks and machinery parked on my land without permission, the video footage of the construction that was happening while I was being kept in the dark. I didn't leave anything out. Gabrielle's actions were laid bare for everyone to see. At first, Gabrielle remained calm, but her composure was starting to crack. She stood at the front, trying to deflect, trying to spin her usual story about how all of this was for the betterment of the community. But I could see the panic in her eyes. The residents, the very people she had manipulated for so long, were starting to doubt her. When I showed the contract outlining the development projects she had been planning on my land, the room erupted. Whispers filled the air as people realized the full extent of her deceit. Gabrielle tried to regain control of the situation, but her usual charm was no match for the overwhelming evidence in front of her. She stammered her words, losing their usual power, but no one was buying her lies anymore. She tried to justify her actions, claiming she was only trying to improve the neighborhood, but the more she spoke, the more the community turned against her. The residents, once too fearful to challenge her, were now demanding answers. Questions were being thrown her way, each one more pointed than the last. The illusion of the benevolent HOA president was gone, replaced by the reality of a woman who had exploited her position for personal gain. At that moment, I knew that this was it, the showdown I had been waiting for. There was no turning back for either of us now. The truth had come out, and Gabrielle's reign over the neighborhood was crumbling. As the meeting went on, I could see the final shift. The board members who had once blindly followed her were now beginning to question her actions. It wasn't just about the land anymore, it was about trust. Gabrielle had lost it all. She had tried to manipulate, deceive, and control us for so long, but now it was clear that she no longer held the power she once did. The community was waking up, and it was no longer just my fight. It was all of ours. As the meeting continued, Gabrielle's attempts to regain control became more desperate, but I could see that the tide had completely shifted in my favor. The room had transformed from a place where Gabrielle had held all the power to one where the truth was taking center stage. Every piece of evidence I presented pushed her further into a corner, and I could feel the weight of it as the community turned their attention to her, no longer willing to accept her excuses. I began by showing the video footage I had recorded, the footage that clearly depicted Gabrielle's construction crew parked on my land, using my property for their own purposes. I'd filmed it as I caught them in the act, with no sign of permission or approval. The sound of machinery whirring to life, the sight of the equipment parked on my lawn, it was undeniable. I clicked to the next image, a photograph of the contract between Gabrielle's construction company and the subcontractors that outlined the development she had planned on my land. I could see the faces of the residents in the room, their eyes widening in disbelief as they saw the name of my property listed as part of the project. A series of hushed gasps filled the air. It was one thing to hear about the land grab, it was another to see it written out in black and white. Gabrielle had made her move, and this contract was the proof of her manipulation. As I turned the page, I showed the meeting minutes from the HOA meetings where Gabrielle had pushed her agenda through with no transparency. In one of the minutes, a passage clearly showed how she had instructed the board to vote on new development projects without any discussion with the residents, completely disregarding the rules. I pointed to the date showing that this had all happened under the guise of improving the neighborhood. The looks on the faces of the board members spoke volumes. They had been used, just like everyone else. Gabrielle stood there, her eyes flickering nervously as she tried to speak, but the words didn't come as easily. Her usual calm demeanor was replaced by unease. I could see that she was losing her grip on the room, her confident facade cracking with every piece of evidence I revealed. "Wade, this is all a misunderstanding," Gabrielle said, her voice shaking slightly. "I'm trying to make this neighborhood better. I've been working for the greater good." Her words, once so convincing, now rang hollow. The more she spoke, the more disconnected she sounded from the reality unfolding around her. I could see her trying to gather her composure, but the truth was too powerful for her to silence. The community was no longer on her side. Better for whom I responded sharply. "You've used this neighborhood for your own gain, Gabrielle. You've manipulated the system, taken land from people, and used your position to line your pockets. And now you're pretending it's all for the greater good." The room went silent for a moment, the weight of the truth settling in. There was no more denying it. Gabrielle had been exposed, her lies no longer holding weight. She tried to deflect again, but it was clear that the community had seen enough. Her carefully constructed image was shattered. One of the board members who had once supported Gabrielle stood up and spoke. I didn't know any of this was going on," he said, his voice quiet but filled with regret. "We trusted you, Gabrielle. We all trusted you. It was the moment I had been waiting for." Gabrielle's power over the HOA was slipping away piece by piece. She had spent so much time manipulating everyone around her, but now, the people who had once supported her were turning against her. The board, the residents, everyone was starting to see her for who she truly was. Gabrielle's face turned pale. Her eyes darted around the room, trying to find any way out of the mess she had created, but there was no escape. The truth had been laid bare. The community, the very people she had deceived, was finally seeing the real Gabrielle Walsh, manipulative, deceitful, and power-hungry. As I watched her falter, I realized that this was the moment everything had changed. The community was no longer under her control. The once feared HOA president was now just a woman, standing in front of a room full of people who were no longer afraid of her. I had fought for so long to expose the truth, and now standing in front of everyone I knew, that victory was within reach. Gabrielle's reign of manipulation was over. As Gabrielle stood in front of the room, trying in vain to salvage her crumbling image, the community began to turn on her. The shock and disbelief on the faces of the residents were palpable. Once the veil of manipulation was pulled away, there was no going back. I could feel the weight of the moment as the board members exchanged uncomfortable glances, the truth sinking in for everyone present. Gabrielle tried to recover, her voice shaking but still laced with that same false sweetness. "You're all making a mistake," she said, her eyes desperately scanning the room. "This is all for the greater good of the neighborhood. You'll regret this when you see the improvements I've planned." But her words were no longer effective. The residents had seen enough. They were no longer the sheep she had led, with empty promises and smooth talk. They were now aware of the damage she had caused, the lies she had spun, and the personal gain she had sought at the expense of the entire community. Her power was slipping away, and with it, the control she had once held over all of us. I stood there watching her unravel, knowing that I had done everything I could to expose her for who she truly was. But I wasn't the only one who had had enough. The board members, now fully aware of the scope of her deception, began to speak up. This can't continue," one of the board members said, his voice trembling. "We trusted you, Gabrielle. We were wrong to let you manipulate us like this. You've gone too far." The residents, emboldened by the truth, were no longer afraid. "You've been taking from all of us," one neighbor said, his voice rising in anger. "You thought you could get away with this, but we won't let you. Not anymore." As more and more voices joined in, the walls that Gabrielle had built around herself began to crumble. She tried to assert control once more, but her words were drowned out by the chorus of anger and betrayal that filled the room. It was clear now that she had lost the trust of everyone present, and there was nothing left to save her position as HOA president. The board voted almost unanimously to remove Gabrielle from her position. The decision came swiftly, like the final nail in her coffin. Her face contorted with shock and disbelief as the vote passed, her power evaporating in an instant. She had thought that she could control the narrative, that she could continue her manipulations without consequence. But now it was clear her reign was over. Gabrielle stood frozen for a moment, as though the reality of her defeat hadn't quite sunk in. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the room, her head held low. She had lost everything, her position, her influence, and her community. The very thing she had fought so hard to control had slipped through her fingers, and it was all because of the truth. As I watched her leave, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The fight had been long, and at times it had felt like an uphill battle. But in the end, the truth had prevailed. Gabrielle's manipulation, her lies, and her greed had been exposed, and she could no longer hide behind her facade. The residents of Sagebrush Estates were no longer under her control. The HOA was free from the grip of corruption, and it was clear that moving forward, the community would stand together against anyone who tried to take advantage of them. For me, this victory wasn't just about reclaiming my land, it was about taking back the community. We had been manipulated for far too long, but now we could rebuild. We could move forward together, stronger and more united than ever before. Gabrielle's power had been destroyed, and with it, the fear that had kept us silent for so long. We were no longer afraid to stand up for what was right. With Gabrielle's removal as HOA president, the community of Sagebrush Estates began to rebuild in ways I never thought possible. The damage she had done was not just physical. It was the erosion of trust, the fear that had kept everyone in line for years. But now, with her gone, something new began to emerge. A sense of unity, strength, and collective resolve that hadn't been there before. The first change came quickly. The HOA, once a puppet in Gabrielle's hands, was now open to transparency. The board was restructured, and new trustworthy members were voted in. The residents finally had a say in the decisions that affected them. We were no longer at the mercy of one person's greed and manipulation. There was a sense of empowerment that spread through the neighborhood, as people began to feel like they had a voice again. It was as if the shackles that had kept us all quiet had been broken, and for the first time in a long while, we could breathe freely. But the physical damage to my property didn't disappear overnight. The ruined garden, the destroyed irrigation system, and the wreckage left by Gabrielle's construction crews still needed to be addressed. However, with the community's support, the work was done. People came together to help restore what had been taken from me, and slowly, my land began to look like it once had lush, green, and thriving again. It was a reminder of what we had lost and what we had regained. In the days following Gabrielle's departure, I received apologies from several of my neighbors who had once doubted me. Some had been too afraid to speak out, others had simply trusted Gabrielle's version of events without question. But now, they saw the truth. One by one, they came to me expressing their regret and offering their support. I wasn't alone in this fight anymore. We had all become part of something bigger than ourselves. As for Gabrielle, I knew her downfall wasn't the end of her fight. She had always been someone who sought control, who used her charm and influence to get what she wanted. I had no doubt that she would try to rebuild her empire elsewhere, but I also knew that she would never have the same kind of power over this community again. The foundation she had built her authority on had crumbled, and she would have to answer for her actions, not just to me, but to everyone she had manipulated along the way. I took comfort in the fact that I had not only fought for my own rights, but for the rights of the entire community. It wasn't just about getting my land back, it was about restoring justice, about showing that no one should ever be able to manipulate or deceive others for their own gain. But perhaps the greatest reward came when I stood in my garden one last time, looking out over the now repaired landscape. It was no longer a symbol of the destruction Gabrielle had caused, but a symbol of resilience. My garden had survived. It had been damaged, but it had endured. And now it was thriving again, just like the community. I wasn't just protecting my land anymore. I was protecting the future of Sagebrush Estates. I had fought not just for myself, but for the neighbors who had once been too afraid to stand up for the ones who had lost faith in their ability to make a difference. Together, we had reclaimed our neighborhood, and we had done it with the power of truth and unity. With Gabrielle gone, the community was healing. It would take time, but we were stronger now, wiser, more united, and more determined to protect what was ours. The lessons we had learned would stay with us for a lifetime, reminding us that when we stand together, there's nothing that can take away our power. And as I looked around at the thriving neighborhood, I knew one thing for certain: we would never let anyone take that power from us again. Months passed since Gabrielle's removal, and the neighborhood had transformed in ways I had never imagined. What had once felt like a place of fear and division had slowly morphed into a tight-knit community once again. People who had once stayed silent now spoke openly about their concerns, and the sense of powerlessness that had once loomed over Sagebrush Estates had been replaced with a newfound strength. It wasn't just the HOA that had changed, it was the entire fabric of our community. People had begun to take an active role in decisions, something that had been taken from us for so long. The monthly meetings were no longer a formality where Gabrielle called all the shots. They had become a place for open discussion and real collaboration. We worked together to address issues that mattered to us, from improving public spaces to ensuring that future development projects were transparent and beneficial for everyone. But the true test of our unity came when we faced the long-term damage Gabrielle had caused. It wasn't just about getting my land back, it was about restoring the entire neighborhood, from the wreckage of Gabrielle's schemes to the trust she had destroyed. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but slowly we began to heal. Neighbors who had once been divided by fear and uncertainty were now coming together, offering support where it was needed. People who had previously been unwilling to stand up were now leading efforts to ensure that the community remained strong and protected from any future threats. I had been hesitant to take the lead in the beginning, unsure if I was the right person for the job. But as I saw the transformation in the people around me, I realized that this wasn't just my fight, it was our fight. Together we had stood up to a powerful manipulator, and together we had reclaimed our future. The experience had taught us that no one person could hold the power to control the community. It was the collective strength of all of us that made us strong. Gabrielle, for her part, had disappeared from the public eye after her downfall. I couldn't say I felt any sympathy for her. She had gotten exactly what she deserved. She had spent her time manipulating others for her own gain, and now the people she had exploited were stronger for having stood up to her. I had no doubt she would try to rebuild elsewhere, but she would never again have the influence she had once wielded here. The damage she had done was irreparable, and she had no one to blame but herself. For me, the real victory wasn't just the restoration of my land. It was the transformation of the community itself. I had fought for my rights, yes, but I had also fought for something much greater, the right for every resident to have a voice, to be heard, and to know that they mattered. No one should ever be able to manipulate, deceive, or control a community again. We had learned our lesson, and we would never forget it. And as I stood in my garden, once again, lush and full of life, I knew that I had not only regained what was mine, but had helped to restore something far more important, the sense of fairness and justice that had been lost. The community had survived its darkest hour and emerged stronger than ever. We had found our voice again, and no one would ever take it away. The future was ours to shape, and I knew that as long as we stood together, no one could ever take that from us. Years passed since the downfall of Gabrielle Walsh, and Sagebrush Estates had become a community transformed. The scars left by her manipulation and deceit had faded, but the lessons we had learned remained etched in our hearts. What was once a neighborhood full of division and fear had grown into a vibrant, united community where trust was no longer something that could be easily broken. The land, which had been the site of so much conflict and destruction, now thrived as a symbol of resilience. My garden, once devastated by construction equipment and ignored by those who had sought to take it from me, had blossomed again into the beautiful sanctuary it once was. The trees I planted, the flowers that had long been cared for with love and patience, grew tall and strong, reminding me every day that things could be rebuilt even when it seemed like all was lost. I spent much of my time in the garden, not only tending to the plants that had survived, but also helping my neighbors restore their own homes and properties. What Gabrielle had once tried to destroy, we had rebuilt together. Every weed pulled, every new plant put in the ground, symbolized a new beginning for the community. It was a reminder that no matter how hard life got, or how badly people tried to tear us down, we had the strength to rise again. But it wasn't just about the physical restoration. What mattered most was the sense of unity that had been forged from the fire of adversity. In the years that followed, we had grown closer, more connected, and more aware of how much power we truly had when we worked together. Every decision made in the neighborhood, from the smallest repairs to the largest developments, was now a collective effort. We no longer stood in the shadow of one person's power. We stood united, ready to defend each other's rights and protect our shared community. One afternoon, I stood outside my house, looking out over the neighborhood. The lawns were green, the trees full of life, and the streets quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos that had once ruled our lives. As I looked around, I realized something important. We had not just fought for my property or for the right to stop Gabrielle's plans, but for something greater, something that would last beyond this one battle. We had fought for the soul of Sagebrush Estates, and in the end, we had won. In the distance, I could see neighbors chatting, laughing, working together. No one was alone anymore. We had created something lasting, something powerful. The dark days of fear, manipulation, and corruption were behind us. It had been a long, hard fight, but we had emerged stronger than ever. I had reclaimed my land, yes, but more than that, I had helped restore a sense of justice, dignity, and hope to a community that had been too afraid to stand up for itself. Gabrielle had once thought she could take it all. She had thought she could control us, manipulate us, and profit from our silence. But in the end, she had underestimated the power of a community united by truth. The garden was proof that no matter how much damage one person could do, the strength of a united community would always prevail. And as I stood there, surrounded by my neighbors, watching the sun set over the now thriving neighborhood, I knew that the battle had been worth it. We had not only taken back what was ours, but had built something even more important, a community that would never again be torn apart by fear or lies. We were free. Looking back, the win wasn't what mattered most. It was the way we handled the situation that truly made the difference. I could have acted on impulse, driven by anger and frustration, but instead I chose to follow the legal process, gathering evidence, keeping track of everything, and letting the law guide my actions. That made all the difference. The outcome would have been very different had I let emotions lead the way. Standing up for what's right doesn't mean escalating things emotionally or violently. It means following the proper channels, even when it feels like the system is stacked against you. Evidence, patience, and following due process were the real tools that helped bring about change. It wasn't about rage, it was about using the law as a shield to protect what was mine and what was right. If I could offer any advice, it's this: document everything. Keep records, check public filings, and know when to bring in an attorney or authorities. It's not about making a stand on your own terms, it's about using the system in a way that can't be easily dismissed. Patience and process carry far more weight than anger. Communities stay strong when people respect the law, and that's something we must never forget. Power in any organization like the HOA only works when it's held accountable. When it goes unchecked, that's when things go awry. The fight wasn't just about one man reclaiming his land, it was about a community like the one we've rebuilt, ensuring that those in power are held to the law. And in the end, that's the true strength we've gained.